it's Melissa again, and today I'm here to talk to you about how to read a textbook. So, a lot of people think they know how to read a textbook. Oh, I'm reading. That I know how to read. That doesn't mean you know how to read a textbook, though. There is a strategy to it, and that's what I'm going to go over today. But before I do that, I just want to give a disclaimer that I'm not an educational professional of any kind. I'm a student and a tutor. But I just want to get that out there real quick. From my experience as a student and a tutor, what has worked for me, and I encourage you to look for other sources besides just mine in helping you figure out what works for you, because everyone has different learning abilities, learning styles. So here we go. Okay, so there are also two different ways to go about reading and taking notes in your textbook. And by this I mean like the kind of order you go in, like what you do. So the first method would be to skim the textbook first. So that's looking at your titles and just getting a gist of what it's about. I talk about it more later. Then taking notes in the book. Then you can take your book notes to class and take your lecture notes, and then afterwards combine your lecture notes with your book notes. So the good thing about that is that you have really thorough notes. And you can also bring your book notes with you to class to reference, so you don't have to copy down everything furiously that your professor says or writes down, which is helpful, especially if you're really stressed about that, because once you already know what you're going to be talking about, then you kind of have an idea of what's important and not already. And if there's something you didn't think was important in the text and your professor tells you about it in class, then you can go back and kind of edit your notes, or you can combine your notes, and you can like put different focuses on it, like what your professor had. Then another way to do it would be to skim first and then highlight a little bit. I'll explain some of that after. Then take notes in lecture, and then take your notes on the book after you've already had the lecture, so that you know what to take notes on. So the great part about this method is that you can kind of tailor it to what you need, so that way you're not taking like ridiculously long notes of stuff in the book that you're not sure if you need or not. You have an idea of what you need to write down, what's important already from the lecture. But the bad thing about that is that you don't really have as good of a handle on the material before your class. So if you know you're going to struggle in the class, then definitely think about doing the first method instead. It's not going to hurt you necessarily to do the second method, but the whole idea of the first method is that you're kind of forcing yourself to go over the material more times, so that will help you. You'll get like extra exposure once you're in class. Okay, so before I explain to you a method for actually reading your textbook, I'm going to go over a few things about your textbook first. So you want to at least read the intro of the book and the table of contents. So if there's a preface to the student or something in there, then you want to read that. I'll show you an example. Okay, so this is my physics textbook. Like I told you, it is kind of important to look at the beginning because it can tell you a lot about the textbook. So you might see things like this, like any of these things within the page, and be like, oh, I don't need to read that, it's not important. Well, this will tell you why you should read it or how to use it if you don't know, which is important. Like for example, here's the life science and bioengineering examples. So if you're pre-med and taking physics, for example, you might want to read that because it'll give you a better perspective of why you need to learn physics for the MCAT and whatnot. Preface to the instructor, you don't have to read that, but it might be helpful to read because your professor probably read it. So here's the preface to the student. I read this one and I thought it was excellent. I don't know what other textbooks are like, but it's definitely worth a read anyway, because there might be some important information in it. This one I found very useful, because it helps you, it tells you what you can get, how to get the most out of your course and how to get the most out of your textbook. So even though this is just a textbook, it's not telling you just about the textbook, it's also telling you about the course, which I think is very helpful, because of course, knowing how to use the textbook is important, but any tips on how to get the most out of your course is also pretty important, I think. Then there's just more pages on that. So, as you just saw, there are important things in there for you to read, so at least skim the beginning parts if not reading them, because it's better to know whether certain parts of the textbook are useful or not before you start reading it. And also, conversely, you might not think something's important, but after you read that introduction part, you'll find out that actually is important and that's something you need to look at. Some other general tips before you start reading. Just remember that, first of all, reading requires focus. So you have to eliminate distractions. So don't be trying to do this when your roommate's in your room, being loud, hanging out with their friends, or don't do it in the commons or something of your college. Any place that it's going to be loud and distracting for you, just don't even bother, because it requires focus. So if you can't focus, then you're just kind of wasting your time trying to read the textbook. Make sure that you're doing this in a productive time frame. And I have a link down below for a tool you can use to help with your productivity and figure out when the best time of your day is to read. And then also realize that this is hard work, and you're going to have to do it if you want to get A's, but it is totally worth it. Okay? So other things you can do is study at the same time every day, so it becomes a habit. I like to study by creating fake study halls. I can show you my schedule in the link down below if you want to see it. I have a bunch of fake study halls that I have to study during. I schedule them like they're classes so that I actually do them. You might want to try that. And also put reading on your to-do list. Don't just say you're going to read it and then, forget about it. Just write it down so that you know you're going to do it and when you're going to do it and all those things. If you want to try a quadrant to-do list instead, which I think is very helpful, you can see that down below as well. Okay, so the method of reading that I'm going to explain to you is called SQ3R, and it stands for Survey, Question, Read, Recite, and Review. It's a method of active studying, and I'm going to break it down. So the first part is the survey, and this is really just skimming, essentially. And this is something that you'd want to do before class so that you have an idea of what's going on, and also do this before you read. So if the chapter that you're going over is covered in more than one lecture, you might want to skim it more than once, like once before each lecture, just to refresh yourself on the material. Even if you do know what's going on, it can help, because like I said earlier, any exposure to material is going to help you remember it. So it is worth it to just skim for 2 minutes. Just 2 minutes. You can do it. And so what exactly do you want to do in your survey? You want to survey the entire chapter. And survey is not reading, like skimming, you're not reading the whole thing, but what I mean is you want to just get the basics. So just reading the titles, maybe look at the bold words or any figures, and definitely read the summary at the end. You might want to read the summary before you skim even, but just make sure you do read the summary as well, because that gives you a better idea, and read the whole summary. Don't skim that or speed read it. No, just read it. Trust me, it's helpful. And at this part, you don't really need to highlight or anything or take notes. Just the idea of it is to just get a gist of what the chapter is about. Okay, so the second part here in the SQ3R is the questioning. You can do this during skimming if you want to, but this is more about while you're actually reading, which I will explain after this one, but this is just, I think this is really important because this is part of your active reading. You don't want to just passively read and like, okay, you know, falling asleep, just reading pages and pages of nonsense or whatever you consider it to be, because you're not going to get too much out of it. I mean, you're going to get a really good idea of what it's about, but you're not really understanding and learning as well if you're just reading it straight. So you want to ask yourself questions while you're reading to help understand how each section fits within the chapter. So you might consider writing your own exam questions while you're reading, which is basically what your professor does anyway, and then save them. Alright, so the third part of the SQ3R, one of the 3 R's, is reading, which I'm sure this is why you're watching this video in the first place. So depending on, you know, which method you do that I talked about in the beginning of the video, whether you read before or after class, you're going to do this at a different time. So if you read before class, you chose the first method. If you read after class, that could be both methods. But, you know, whatever works for you. And what you're doing is active reading, and you're going to read everything. Everything. Yes, everything. I know a lot of people just want shortcuts. They're like, oh, I have so much to read, you know, I don't think I can get it done. You probably can. And you're pretty much just wasting your time if you're not reading the entire thing. Why bother reading it if you're not going to read the entire thing? I can't stress that enough, I guess. But how do you want to do this? So you want to have your class notes out in front of you if you're doing it after lecture, or while you're combining your notes if you already did it before lecture. And if you're doing that, then focus on the points that were emphasized during the lecture. And your goal here is to answer the questions that you made during the question portion while you're reading. Or, well, if you're making questions simultaneously while you're reading, try to answer them. And while you're reading and you try to answer them, you don't have to make sure they're correct immediately. Just kind of give like a first try and then go back later and like check them. At this point, you want to take notes and or highlight. Okay, so here is an example of like some of my organic chemistry notes. This is just the first page in there, so that's why it's like general chemistry review. But you can see in there that I have like dashes and then arrows to go like indent. You want to have a system where you have different indentations for different levels of what you're talking about. So you have like the title, and then you have points, which you have as like dashes, or maybe you want to do bullet points, whatever. And then if you have a detail in that, you know, indent, put a different symbol. Then if you have more details from that, indent again and put a different symbol. So it's just a good way of organizing your notes. And also I want to point out, do you see how like little space there is here? Yeah, that's not the best thing to do, I'd say, because then it looks like a huge block of text. So I will show you what I have, well, some newer notes that I have. Here are some of my psych notes. You can see that the indentations, indentations here are a lot more exaggerated, so it doesn't look as much like a big block of text as the other one did. When you are taking the notes, you know, you can follow the whole indentation method that I showed you, but you might also consider just summarizing each paragraph individually into little sentences if you want, if you think that's easier, or if you just prefer to read it like that, whatever. But your notes are important because then you can refer back to your notes instead of having to read the text again. I think that's the biggest thing for me, because I mean it takes me a while to read the textbook and take notes and everything, so why would I want to read the textbook again? So the next part of the 3 R's of SQ3R is to recite. So what you want to do with this is, well, a number of things. One of them is like after every paragraph you read, You can orally ask yourself questions about it, and then, of course, write them down so you can answer them later. It's just another way to learn. So, some people are visual, some people are kinesthetic, they like to do things with their hands, but some people learn well because they're auditory learners. So even if you're not an auditory learner, it's still another level of, or layer, I guess, of understanding that you can just pile on. Just more exposure to material, the better you know it. Record recitation of your notes. So once you have all the book notes written down, you can record yourself reading them to yourself and then listen to them while you're driving, while you're at the gym, whatever.